You are listening to Leaders Unedited with Keo.
Welcome to this episode of Leaders Unedited. I'm your host, Margit Mansfield, and with me today I have Trish Ridsdale, owner of Board Business. Welcome, Trish.
Hello, Margit. Thank you very much for asking.
Thank you for joining us. And as a governance advisor to boards, I've noticed just increasing expectations of boards over the years. What's your view on how expectations of boards have shifted over the last few years?
Margit, expectations have changed enormously, and some of those expectations have been a long time coming and some have been really quite recent. So if I think about some of the longer term, as directors we get really conflicting information. On the one hand, our job is to work on oversight, to remain above the fray, to not be operational. But on the other, there also seems to be an expectation that we will be intimately involved in every single minute issue in the organisation. Now, that's been the case for quite some time, but I think that that sort of disconnect of messaging has become even louder in recent times. But in addition to that, if we think about how our landscape has changed, we've now got the rise of what some people call stakeholder capitalism as opposed to shareholder capitalism. So the pressure on boards to be really, really mindful, not just what the views of their shareholder base might be, but also the communities within which they operate, and increasingly staff. And I think we've never had a time when we've got so many stakeholders with such strong views about what we should and should not be doing, and with very loud voices to let us know very, very quickly. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it certainly increases the challenge of being a director in terms of being really clear on what is the important focus for our organisation. I think one of the interesting things that I find is that the expectations of our staff and the communities that we operate in have galloped away well in advance of legislation. And I think that is a really significant change if I think about previous years when boards might have been brought to the table on certain issues when legislation required them to. Those days are rather gone. It's now that we've got so many stakeholders that have a view about what we should be doing, so we've got to be very, very clear. And we talk about a need to bring the voices of our stakeholders into the boardroom. And that's been a really important governance change, I think, since about 2018, that there's an expectation that boards look beyond the metrics that we get given from the management team, that it's not sufficient purely to look at the reporting, but to find ways to really touch and feel and hear the issues from our various stakeholder groups, all at the same time, while not undermining the CEO and the management team.
Well, that was my next question, though, because you talk about those conflicting messages about providing oversight and then getting involved in the detail. That means you rub up against the CEO and the management team. And how do you navigate that necessary tension that happens between the board and the management team that are leading the organisation?
We look for that tension to be there and to be constructive, and I always talk about when I look at boards, and I've got a great privilege to be involved in conducting board reviews around Australia, and I can always tell when a board hasn't quite got the balance right between holding management to account, which is our role, but we also have a role in providing guidance and support to the management team. And if you have a board that is very much, we're here to hold the management to account, but there's no guidance and support, you sense that very quickly because the management team feel the need to sort of strap on metaphorical armour before every board meeting. Every board meeting is simply the next battle in the war. And that creates a really dysfunctional dynamic between the board and the management team. But equally, if a board is overweight the other way, it's all guidance and support and it's not holding the management team to account, that is equally dysfunctional but for a different reason. Because the board becomes a cheerleader almost for everything that the CEO and the management team bring to them, and that's not useful either. So if we think about how do we try to get the relationship right, I often talk to our management team about understanding the rules of engagement.
Okay.
So by that I mean making sure that the board really understands what its role is, and the interface with the management team, but for the management team to understand it as well. So if I can give you an example, quite often I'll have executives say to me, the board, they ask too many questions. And I reflect on that, and I sort of have to remind them that, yeah, but that's their job. It's the job of the board to ask questions. But sometimes management can feel as though, does the board not trust us? Do they not think we're professionally competent? And that's not the case at all. So I often sort of say, let's understand the rules of engagement. If we ask you questions, it's not because we don't trust you, and it's not because we don't think you're competent, but it is our job to trust but also to verify. And we do that through the questions that we ask. So why don't you think about changing your mindset that the questions from the board are actually an opportunity for you to demonstrate just how competent you actually are, that you're actually all over the issue. And so that's got to be a really positive outcome. But equally, those questions might also identify some of the gaps in your own thinking on this particular issue, which might in fact be a great benefit to you as a management team. So that's my sort of advice to the management team. My advice to the board, though, is think long and hard about the questions that we're going to ask. Because if you're a board that peppers the management team with 85 questions on every, that's not a board that's thinking about where is the value going to be added. And think about how you're going to ask the question. I wince every time I hear a board member say something like, give me comfort that, or I am very concerned. Now, I'm not suggesting that the issue they want to raise is not important, but my concern is the personalisation of the comment that is heard by the management team as, well, you don't understand, you're feeling uncomfortable maybe because you don't understand it, or you're feeling uncomfortable because you haven't read the board papers properly, or you see what I mean about that personalisation. So I think that there's some real, there's a real art as well as science to being, a board member and thinking about how do I exert influence, how do I have the best impact, and how do I ensure that we're fulfilling our obligations as directors by holding the management team to account, but also providing guidance and support.
Gee, it's such a tricky balancing act, isn't it? It's very delicate.
It is really, really delicate.
So you mentioned mindset, and I'm curious about, you serve on very different boards of very different organisations, from cooperatives to not-for-profits to commercial enterprises. How does that differ as a board member? Does your mindset change? Does your leadership style have to change?
The answer in part is yes. The director's role is the same. It doesn't matter the type of industry or the company type. But I think there are some nuanced differences that is important to be aware of. And if I can give you an example, if you are on the board of a shareholder-based organisation where the board has a number of significant shareholders around the table, the chances are you have an ability to influence change quite quickly. Compare that to being on the board of a government-owned entity, where the ability to affect change can feel glacial in its pace at times. So you need to go in very much with your eyes wide open on those particular boards. And so understanding who's the shareholder, what is their appetite for doing things differently, better, whatever. What are the issues in this organisation, and again, what is the appetite for those to be addressed is an important part of due diligence. We often talk about, check the balance sheet and check insolvency and check a range of things, and they're terribly important. But I also think it's incredibly important to understand who are the shareholders or the members, what are their objectives, and am I prepared as a director to really align myself to those objectives? Because as a director you work incredibly hard to make other people successful. And for me personally, unless I have an emotional connection either to the individuals or to the issue, it's very hard for me to sort of get very excited about, about the board role. I've had a real privilege, and I didn't plan it this way, but I've been on the boards of cooperatives and mutuals for the past 17 years, and they are just so special, incredibly special. They are the ultimate in democracy. Even if you're a shareholder-based cooperative, every shareholder has one vote, regardless of the size of their business. Makes it quite different, and those cooperatives have the majority of cooperative members sitting around the board table. And there's great strength in that because there's incredible industry knowledge around the table. The difficulty around that is perhaps helping those people understand you're good at operating a business this size, but now you're on a board of an organisation that collectively is this size. But understanding the conflicts of interest that are absolutely inherent in that, because you're a shareholder of the company, you're a director of the company, and you're an employee or a customer of the services of the company. So understanding which hat you've got on your head at any point in time is important. So I've always been in the role of an independent director, and my role, in my view, is about helping educate everyone else around the table about how we manoeuvre our way through some of those difficulties, leveraging the strength of the board while making sure that no one inadvertently gets themselves into difficulty. So I do think you need to be mindful of the type of organisation and the shareholding base, but our duties as directors are absolutely the same, regardless of the type of organisation.
And it sounds to me like being a director is not for the faint-hearted. And yet there's so many people now that have, I've done the company directors course, or I've got this on my career path. I mean, what would you say to people who are, actively looking for a board role?
The first question I'd ask them is why. And I'm often approached by people wanting, advice in this space, and I always ask that question first, because if the answer is I want to do something different, and I want to transition, and I still want a very, very good, kind of salary, I often say, well, perhaps stick with your day job. It seems to me that regardless of the type of organisation, you'll never get remunerated for the effort and the time and the risk that you put in. It's not a commensurate thing. So you have to be doing it for reasons other than just the remuneration. I would encourage people to think about what are the types of organisations where they think they can add value, and what they are very happy to align themselves with, and also to think about how do they want their board roles to be represented in their brand. And so sometimes people think about, well, that means I want to be on this type of organisation, I want to be in this sort of industry, and I'm not going to do this, this and this. But equally, you've got to think about who are the people that you're prepared to be associated with. Because one of the great things of being on a board is that we do nothing as individuals, we do it collectively. We have to bring individual judgment to the board table, but all decisions are collective. Our reputations do not stand on our own. Our reputation is tied to every other person that's sitting around that board table. So you need to think long and hard if you're prepared to have your biggest asset, that's not the sort of the intangible asset, which is your reputation, in the hands of the people around the board table. And sometimes people don't think of that being sort of top of mind.
Well, that's certainly not advice that I hear often when considering a board position. You often, get run through the technical checklist of what will qualify you to be a board director, but you're talking about almost the intangibles that are just as important.
It is, and I think if you're starting out on your very first board role, I'd really encourage people to try and target a board where you've got some really good, well-experienced people who truly understand governance around the table. Because if your very first board is perhaps a little immature in its governance development, the people around the table may not necessarily be as skilled as and experienced as that board needs, you don't know what good looks like if it's your first exposure on a board. So the very first role, if you can target an organisation that's a little bit more developed in its governance maturity, and it's got some people around the board who really, really seriously know how to do the job well, it will stand you in good stead because you will understand what good looks like. And it doesn't mean to say that you won't have great benefit in joining other boards and being part of the solution later, But I think it's a big gig on your very, very first board role to be the provider of, you know, the solutions to the problems if you've not really had much experience in actually doing that before.
That's great advice. Now, we're very interested in the recent focus on culture, organisational culture, but boards are very squarely in the firing line when it comes to organisational culture, and I think more so in recent years. What's your view on the board's role in shaping culture?
Do you know, I remember, because I've been around long enough now to remember, when this really started being part of the conversation, and it's close to 20 years ago. And a lot of non-executives said, hang on. You know, no, we're not responsible for culture. The CEO is. We're responsible for hiring the CEO. Go and talk to the CEO if there's a problem with culture. We don't see the organisation. We simply turn up at the boardroom, you know, 11 times a year. We can't possibly be held accountable for culture. And well, that ship has somewhat sailed. That's certainly no longer a defence. And if you think about the really important decisions that we make, it's absolutely understandable. So we're not front and centre in the organisation like the CEO and the management team are, and we shouldn't be. That's not our role. But some of the really big decisions that are made by the organisation, they're held in the hands of the board. And some of those decisions that speak quite directly to culture are, well, firstly, the very choice of CEO. It's one of the most significant drivers. And we've seen examples in recent years of organisations who've employed people who have got a fantastic background for bringing in the money, technically beyond reproach, but whose style and leadership and general personality perhaps is not such a good fit today for what our staff expects. In some instances, what our regulator expects and what our community expects. But some of the other levers that we have is that the board approves the reward and recognition systems that operate in the organisation, and there is no more direct driver of behaviour in an organisation than reward and recognition systems.
Yes.
And so, and we've learned as boards that we have to ask the question, what is the unintended behaviour that this system might actually drive? Because humans are marvellous things. They really are. We know how to cut corners better than the rest. We know how to game the system. So from a board point of view, we need to be asking that in advance. And also whether our reward and recognition system is driving the behaviours that are the right behaviours for the culture that we think is appropriate. But there are other things we do. The performance targets that we give an organisation have the potential to drive behaviours, some positively, some not so positively. So we actually hold incredible levers when it comes to culture, and it is absolutely appropriate that a board is expected to regularly assess whether or not its policy settings, its decisions are actually reinforcing the culture the organisation wants. Having said that, sometimes it feels like catching smoke.
Okay.
So understanding where the overall culture of the organisation, I don't think that's necessarily difficult, but often boards find themselves in the gun because there's a particular action that's occurred by an individual or a group that is inconsistent with perhaps those policy positions or inconsistent with the espoused view of the values of the organisation, and people will turn to the board and say, how did you allow that to happen? So again, it's that I think that tension between understanding at a high level what's happening, but understanding, you know, at the lower levels where that might be consistent or not. So I mean, you guys are the experts in the culture space. We need models and frameworks to help us understand what is really going on, and also understanding what culture actually means as well. I often talk to the boards about what is the cultural strengths in the DNA of your organisation, because every organisation can speak to their cultural strengths, because often it's aligned to the discipline that the organisation is based on. So, excuse me, if I can give you an example. I was on the board of a global mining equipment manufacturer that was stacked to the gunnels of engineers, and I would argue the best engineers, you know, that we've got on the globe. And I never had to worry about the quality of the equipment. It was outstanding. It was brilliantly designed and brilliantly manufactured. And that was the cultural DNA. But where was it potentially a weakness? And all my engineering friends will reinforce this comment. The concept of prototype early and fail fast did not feature in that DNA. It was, can I see it yet? No, you can't. It's not ready.
So that perfectionism.
Correct,
that
sort of building the prototype.
Yeah.
So, and you never wanted to mess with the things that
Yes.
were strengths, but what it did inform the board about were what are the extra questions that we needed to be asking, because the organisation intuitively wouldn't ask those questions of themselves. And I think you can do that for every organisation, and to ask the question, where are our cultural strengths, but at times, where might it be a disadvantage? So another example is I was working with a pharmaceutical company with some of the best scientists you've seen anywhere. I mean, evidence-based, I mean, just extraordinary. Quality of the process is beyond reproach. But try talking innovation to a group like that. Because their first question is, show me where it's been successful before. Oh, that's the problem. You see, so if we
Yes.
understand from a board point of view, where are we strong, where might that not play well, then it can inform a board as to some of the questions it should be asking the CEO and the management team about how do we actually bridge those gaps in some areas of our business.
Now, Trish, I remember when you were facilitating the Australian Institute of Company Directors, you talked a lot about conflict of interest and specifically how you manage conflicts of interest as the chair of a board. And what I found really interesting was, how you socially engage with other members of the board. I was really interested in that. Would you mind just elaborating on how you navigate those conflicts of interest personally, particularly when you're the chair of a board?
Look, I take a really black and white view about this, so I'm not suggesting it's everyone else's view. But from a conflict of interest, I will actively disadvantage myself than ever be in a position where anyone could suggest that I was in a position of conflict. Now, I know there's a whole range of people who kind of think might suggest that that's maybe extreme, but as an independent director, it is the best way that I can demonstrate my independence and protect my reputation as well. But in terms of, if I understand what you're referring to, I talk to the board a lot about the hats that they wear on their heads. That if you have a single hat, which an independent director does, happy days. I'm not saying that makes you, better able to fulfil your role, but you don't have to manage the conflict of interest piece. Many people around boardrooms today do have multiple hats. They might be, the managing director, he's a director and the CEO, he might be a shareholder, there's a range of reasons why you might be wearing multiple hats. And so I spend a lot of time with boards really asking them to reflect on what is the conversation that needs to be had in this boardroom with your director hat on only. And I will respectfully bring it to the attention of directors if I think they've got perhaps the wrong conversation with the wrong hat on. But equally I will provide opportunities for the shareholder conversations to be had here and the customer conversations to be had here. But I've seen too many boards get themselves into difficulty, sometimes legally, by not managing those conflicts well. But there are some other things that I do. I'm very happy, in the old days when we used to fly interstate for our national board meetings every month, we would get together the night before for dinner, and people would fly in at different times. And I had a very clear view that if all of the directors were at the table, I had no difficulty at all if there were some conversations that took place about the agenda for the following day. But if even one director was missing, the answer was no, because you disadvantage the person who is not around the table, and I don't think that's appropriate. So they're the sort of rules that I run to. I don't socialise with the CEO at all, other than for business at all. And the reason is I never want to have anyone to be confused about what my job is. And my job is not to be a friend. My job is not to be a close social contact, because that puts me in a position of conflict. But equally, I also am very careful about how I socialise with directors. I socialise with all directors. I'll meet with them one-on-one, but I'm very, very alert to being seen to have a social relationship with one or two directors that's different to other directors. And I think as chair, it's critically important to do that. You have to be seen to be incredibly fair, incredibly even-handed, Solomon at times, and I don't think that you can do that while people have question marks in their mind about the relationships that you have with various members. But as I said, I'm very black and white, but they're rules that have stood me in good stead over many years. But every director and chair has got to work out, I suppose, what works for them.
Trish, you've got so much wisdom and so much experience, and I'm sure some hard lessons learnt along the way. And you have so many hats in terms of what you do. What advice would you give to your younger self now?
Look, the reason I'm laughing is because I would give the advice, but I know my younger self probably wouldn't have taken it anyway. I think so many of us, when we start out in our careers, whether it's the first board role or our first management role, really suffer from that imposter syndrome. That, oh my gosh, I'm not quite sure I'm supposed to be here, and when are they going to work out, that I'm not up to the role. And all of my life, I was very fortunate to be often the first female in the role, and I think that imposter syndrome was, kind of really very loud for me. So I would be saying to my younger self, trust yourself, have confidence, and think about how it is that you choose to fit in to this particular environment that you're now in, but more importantly, decide how you choose to stand out. And that is still very good advice for me, every board I join, because they're all different. The idea about how am I going to fit in, but how is it I'm going to choose to stand out and make those decisions very, very wisely. I think it's really important when you're starting out to think about your presence and what is the presence that you want to generate. Because when you walk into a room, you've got 4 seconds to make an impact, so what is the impact that you actually want to make? And I don't think I thought enough about those types of things when I was younger. And the other thing I would say to my younger self is that arts degree with the psychology major is going to really work for you later in life. Don't you worry about it now, with everyone telling you that science is what you should have done. That psychology major has been gold in helping you navigate boardrooms around the country.
Well, I think psychology faculties are going to love you for that. But Trish, look, it's been a delight to chat to you, and thank you for standing out, and I mean that in a really positive way. It was one of the reasons why I reached out to you to come and talk to us, so I've really enjoyed chatting to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.